The person causing the most damage in your relationship may not be your partner. It may be your nervous system. I know that's probably not what you expected me to say. And most people spend years focusing on what their partner is doing wrong, pointing the finger, placing blame. They're focused on the criticism, the shutdown, the defensiveness, the conflict, maybe the lack of communication, the distance, or just overall hurtful behavior. But what if many of those behaviors are simply symptoms? What if the real issue isn't what's happening between the two of you? What if it's what's happening inside of you? Because when people become emotionally flooded and activated or triggered, they're going to often say things they don't mean. They react in ways they later regret, and they create distance when what they actually want is connection. And if you don't understand emotional regulation, you're going to continue repeating the same painful relationship patterns over and over again, no matter who you're with. And so the problem is not your partner, it's your nervous system. I'm Jenn Pinkerton, psychotherapist and connection expert. I help people stop repeating the same painful relationship patterns and start actually building healthier, more connected relationships where you thrive. So one of the things I've learned with working with individuals and couples for years is that many of the struggles that people bring into therapy are not actually communication problems. Sometimes they're not even the intimacy problems people struggle with. They aren't even the conflict problems where you're just fighting a lot. And they're really just about dysregulation. People often know what they should do. They know they shouldn't yell, they shouldn't scream. We shouldn't say hurtful things to partners. And they know they should listen. They know that they should try to stay calm. And they know that they should communicate in a very different way. But the problem is that this might be out of people's scope, because when emotions become intense, all of that awareness can disappear in an instant. Because once the nervous system takes over, people often stop responding from their values and identity, and they start reacting just from wounds. And that's what we're talking about today. What emotional regulation actually is and why it matters so much. How it impacts every relationship that you have. And why learning this skill might be one of the most important investments that you're ever going to make in your life. Because this isn't just about your relationship. This is your overall emotional health with everyone you interact with. I remember working with this couple, and they loved each other so deeply. They weren't even questioning whether they wanted to stay together. They knew that was not an option to be apart. There wasn't an affair. There wasn't any abuse. There wasn't even some major crisis that threatened the relationship. But what they couldn't understand was why every single time they were in a disagreement, it became so painful. So conversation about dinner could turn into a huge argument. A small misunderstanding about a schedule could become a 2-day stand-down conflict war. One partner's hurt, the other partner feels so unbelievably defensive. One is pursuing and chasing, and the other is withdrawing and shutting down. And both people left the conversation feeling misunderstood, and nobody felt seen. And they felt very disconnected and really emotionally exhausted. So at first, this couple, they were convinced they had this communication problem. They came to me, Jenn, teach me how to talk to each other. Because they'd read books, they listened to podcasts, they'd listen to my podcast, they learned communication techniques, but nothing was sticking. And as we began to slow things down and do what I call power in the pause in session, something became clear. The issue wasn't that they didn't know how to communicate together. The issue was that neither one of them knew how to stay emotionally regulated when they became activated. And so the moment that hurt entered the room, their nervous systems completely took over. And one person's nervous system moved towards this feeling of criticism and pursuit. And the other person's nervous system would actually move in the opposite direction towards being defensive and withdrawing. And neither person was intentionally trying to create this disconnection. In fact, both of them were trying to just protect themselves back to that emotional safety that I talk about so much. And when I explained that to them and gave them this different perspective, it changed the way they understood their relationship. So the problem wasn't the conflict. The problem was what was happening inside of each of them during that conflict. Because when people become activated and triggered and they become emotionally dysregulated, they lose total access to the very skills that they need most. Curiosity disappears. Empathy, gone. Flexibility disappears. Connection, absent. And then survival takes over. And that realization changed everything for them. Because instead of spending all their energy trying to fix each other, they started learning how to understand themselves and learning how to understand their nervous system. And that is where real change began. So, what is emotional regulation actually? Because people sometimes don't really understand that. And when you hear that, you might often imagine somebody who is maybe never gets upset. They never get angry. They never lash out. Maybe it's someone who's calm 24/7. Maybe they never cry. They never emote. They never get angry. They never feel anxious. They never get triggered. But that is not emotional regulation. In fact, some of the most emotionally dysregulated people I meet can look calm on the outside because they are suppressing and holding everything that's happening in on the inside. Emotional regulation is not the absence of emotion. It's the ability to experience emotion without becoming completely controlled by it. So think about the last time you felt hurt by your partner, your spouse or your loved one. Maybe they forgot something important to you. Maybe they criticized you. Maybe they disappointed you. And maybe they said something that touched a wound and struck a chord that you've carried for years. And in that moment, emotions show up automatically. You didn't choose them. You didn't decide to feel hurt. You didn't decide to feel angry. At a moment's notice, you didn't decide to feel rejected. Your nervous system just responded before your logical brain even had time to catch up. So the question is not whether you're going to have emotions or not. The question is, what are you going to do with them when they arrive? And that is emotional regulation. So the questions look like, can you feel hurt without becoming cruel? Can you feel disappointed without shutting down? Can you feel rejected without becoming controlling? Can you feel anxious without becoming hypervigilant? Can you feel angry without becoming destructive? And that last one's the biggest one, because all these are moments where emotional regulation matters. And I often tell couples that emotions are messengers. They're not dictators. They're supposed to give us an idea of information. It's data. They're not supposed to take over the entire relationship. And unfortunately, many people never learned what to do with difficult emotions. And this is attachment-based. Because some people learn how to explode. Some people learn to avoid. Some people learn to numb with substances or other things. Some people learn to suppress. And some people learn to become defensive. When they feel attacked. Some people learn to attack first before they could be hurt. But every one of these strategies I'm mentioning, these maladaptive coping strategies, originally they did develop for a reason. Most of them started off like a survival adaptation. It's a skill that you honed. And at some point in their life, they help that person cope with something, a feeling, a moment. It helped them avoid pain at that time. It helped them avoid maybe shame that was intolerable. Maybe it helped them avoid feeling rejected. But the problem is that what protects us individually damages us relationally. We can't think individually anymore. In a relationship, it has to look differently. So think about if criticism was common in your childhood, then maybe defensiveness is your protection strategy. If conflict didn't feel safe growing up, then maybe shutting down is your coping skill to protect yourself. And if abandonment was part of your story, then anxiety and hypervigilance and fawning may become your full-on protection strategy to people please to feel safe. If vulnerability was punished, then control may become your protection strategy. None of these behaviors happen because people are bad. None of these things are bad. They happen because people are trying to feel safe. We're all searching for emotional safety. And that's one of the most important shifts I try to help people make. So instead of asking, what's wrong with me? How about asking, what is my nervous system trying to protect me from? And that question creates compassion, and compassion creates awareness. So the challenge is that these same protective strategies, they often create the very outcome that we're trying to avoid. The irony there, right? So the person that becomes so critical because they're afraid of disconnection often pushes their partner away. They are being extremely avoidant. And maybe the person who shuts down because they're afraid of conflict often creates more conflict. The person who becomes controlling because they're so very afraid and fear-based of uncertainty often creates way more distance, which is even more intolerable. And the person who becomes defensive because they're afraid of shame then often prevents repair, which is so crucial. So this is why emotional regulation is so powerful. It is going to allow us to recognize what's happening inside of us before we automatically react. It gives us that moment to pause, the power in the pause. It gives us a moment to ask ourselves, what am I actually feeling right now? And what is this situation bringing up for me? Maybe what do I need? What would help me feel connected instead of reactive? How can I respond instead of react? And then that pause changes everything. Power in the pause, because emotional regulation creates space between feeling and reacting. And inside that space lives choice. And inside that space lives maturity. And inside that space lives healing. I can't tell you how many couples sit in my office or I'm on Zoom and they're convinced they have this communication problem for every fight. And I can immediately see, no, this is a regulation problem. Because communication only works when people are emotionally available enough to communicate. When someone is flooded with hurt and fear and shame and anger or anxiety, they lose access to those very skills that they need most. Curiosity is gone. Empathy is gone. Listening, absolutely absent. Flexibility, gone. And so then the very thing you're wanting most, the connection, you're not going to be able to get. You're just surviving. So that survival is taking over and people do not respond from any good place. They're just reacting to all the wounds. And that's why this isn't a luxury skill. It's one of the most important relationship skills that you will ever develop. Because every conversation, every conflict, every repair attempt, every vulnerable moment, and every act of intimacy is actually influenced by your ability to stay connected to yourself. And especially when difficult emotions are present. That's what emotional regulation is really all about. It's not becoming less emotional, which most people think that's what it is. It's not becoming like less control. It's being more able to manage your emotions. So if you're listening to this and you think, wow, some of these patterns sound achingly familiar, I have created a free resource that can help. It's called the PRHI. It's my Pinkerton Relational Health Index. And this PRHI helps you identify the strengths and growth areas in your relationship, including communication patterns, emotional safety, conflict cycles, connection, intimacy, trust, and of course, emotional regulation and the triggers that may be keeping you stuck. Because awareness is always the first step towards change. And you can't heal a pattern that you can't see. And one of the reasons that people stay stuck for so very long is because they don't fully understand what's actually happening underneath the problem or inside of them. So the PRHI helps you identify those blind spots so you can begin creating a healthier pattern and you can create a stronger connection. So you can download it by using the link below. One of the great misunderstandings about relationships is the belief that conflict is primarily about communication. And you're going to hear me badmouth communication because it's just what everybody thinks it's all about. And yes, words matter and tone matters and listening matters, but underneath all of that is something so much more powerful and so much bigger, and that is your entire nervous system. Because whether you realize it or not, your nervous system is participating in every single interaction you have with your partner. And it's not just your partner. It's your best friend. It's your mom. It's your child. It's everybody. And it participates right when anybody walks through the door. It participates when your partner doesn't text you back. It participates when your partner criticizes something you've done. It participates when they reach for affection, when they're reaching out for intimacy. It participates when they pull away. And long before your logical brain has fully processed what's happening, your nervous system has already begun asking a series of really important questions. Am I accepted? Am I valued? Am I loved? Am I rejected? Am I criticized? Am I going to get hurt? All these questions are running through your nervous system's mind, right? And the thing is, your nervous system doesn't only respond to what's happening in the present moment. It takes that present moment, but it's that present moment and what it reminds you of. This is where attachment is so also interconnected and interwoven to your nervous system, because many people believe they're just reacting to their partner. But in reality, they're often reacting to a lifetime of experiences that their partner unknowingly activated. It's that reminder of what we repeat, what we don't heal. For example, if you grew up feeling criticized, then a simple piece of feedback from your partner may feel way bigger than it really is. If you experienced abandonment when you were younger, then maybe a delayed text message may trigger this anxiety and this feeling that has very little to do with the text itself. If you learned that conflict was dangerous and it wasn't safe, then even a minor disagreement may feel absolutely threatening, even when your partner is trying to have a healthy conversation. So this is why two people can experience the exact same event and have very different emotional responses and reactions, because the event isn't the issue. It's the meaning attached to the event. And I often see this happen. One partner is going to say something relatively neutral, but the other partner has this huge emotional reaction that's shocking. And both people become really confused because the first person is thinking, wait, why are they reacting so strongly? And then the second person is thinking, why don't they understand how I'm feeling? Because it's so big. Why don't they see how much this hurt me? But neither person realizes that the nervous system is interpreting the interaction through their own lens. And one of the most helpful things that couples can learn is that if their reaction is often telling them something, it's probably something important. And not about today, not necessarily about the present, but about what the present is touching. Because relationships have an incredible ability to expose all of our unresolved wounds. And the person closest to us has access to places inside of us that nobody else can reach. That can be beautiful. And it can also be extremely uncomfortable because your partner can trigger feelings of inadequacy. Your partner can trigger these feelings of rejection, of abandonment, feelings of shame, which can be so pervasive and so big, and feelings of not being enough. Not because they're intentionally trying to hurt you, but because intimacy naturally exposes vulnerability. And so the closer someone gets to us, the more likely they're going to touch places that are already sensitive. And when those places get touched, the nervous system often reacts automatically. It reacts in kind. And this is where people move into what we call survival responses. Some people fight. Some people become critical. They're reactive. They're controlling. Some people flee. Some people avoid or distract. They stay busy. Some people are going to change the subject. Other people are going to freeze. Somebody's going to go numb. They're going to shut down. Some people fawn, people please, over accommodate, abandon their own needs. And all of those responses I'm listing have one thing in common. They were all originally designed to help someone survive. And that challenge is that survival strategies rarely create any connection. What protects us from pain prevents intimacy. The person who becomes defensive may be protecting themselves from shame. Valid. The person who withdraws may be protecting themselves from overwhelm. Okay. The person who criticizes might be protecting themselves from vulnerability. Even the person who becomes controlling may be protecting themselves from uncertainty. But the nervous system is always going to try to keep us safe. The problem is that sometimes it's going to treat these emotional discomforts as if it is danger. I mean, the tiger's in the room, right? And that changes how we show up. And this is why awareness matters so much for your relationship, because the moment you can recognize that your nervous system is activated, you are gaining options. You have choices. Instead of immediately reacting, you can pause, power in the pause. You can become curious. You can lean in and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What is the story in my head? What does this remind me of? What am I afraid of in this moment? And what do I need right now? And those questions help move you out of automatic survival and back into intentional connection. Because the goal is not to stop having emotional reactions. We are human. The goal is to become aware of them before they start ruining and driving everything in your relationship. So the more awareness you develop around your nervous system, then the more freedom you're going to gain and how you respond. And that is where emotional regulation starts becoming transformational. Because now you're no longer reacting automatically. You're responding intentionally. You're responding intelligently. And those are two very different ways of living. I want you to think about the last time you were really upset. Not mildly irritated, not slightly annoyed, but I mean truly activated. Maybe you felt deeply hurt by something your partner said. Maybe you felt rejected. Maybe you felt criticized. Maybe you felt dismissed, or you were just so unbelievably misunderstood. So now ask yourself this question. How much access did you have to your best self in that moment? Here's how we know. Were you curious? Were you compassionate? Were you patient? Were you empathetic? Did you go to their feeling? Were you open-minded? I highly doubt it. Because when people become emotionally flooded, something very predictable happens. The brain will start prioritizing protection over connection. The nervous system shifts from relationship mode and thinking relationally into individualistic survival mode. And once that happens, the qualities that create healthy relationships often begin disappearing. So curiosity disappears, empathy decreases, perspective narrows. And it is like you are looking through the most myopic view of the world. And flexibility becomes so difficult. People start reacting from protection rather than responding from intention. And this is why emotionally dysregulated people often become the exact opposite of who they want to be. The loving partner becomes very critical. The patient partner becomes extremely reactive. The compassionate partner becomes so defensive. And the connected partner becomes withdrawn and distant. And not because their character has changed, that's who they are, but it's because their nervous system took over. One of the things I explain to couples is that emotional flooding temporarily reduces our ability to even think relationally. So when you're flooded and you're overwhelmed, your brain isn't asking, oh, how can I better understand my partner? It's instead asking or screaming, how do I protect myself right now? Those are really different goals. They're not aligned. Because protection often sounds like, let me explain why I'm right. Let me prove my point. Let me defend myself. Let me shut this down. Let me get far away from this. And the problem is that while these strategies temporarily might reduce discomfort, they are often going to create more distance. And this is where so many couples get trapped. So one person has become really hurt and they are pursuing, they are chasing you down to talk it through. And the other person, or scream it through, and the other person becomes overwhelmed and withdraws and shuts down. Someone's critical, someone else is defensive, someone's screaming, yelling, escalating, someone has shut down completely, and both people are trying to protect themselves. Neither person is trying to create disconnection. And yet disconnection is becoming the outcome. So what makes this even more challenging is that emotional flooding often feels justified. Because when we're hurt, we tend to believe that our reaction is entirely about what is happening right now in the here and now. But emotional reactions are rarely just about the present. I really want you to remember that. Not just about the present moment. They're a combination of what's happening right now, and then everything else at that moment is touching from the past. This is why a relatively small event can sometimes be so unbelievably big and produce a really large reaction. The event itself may not even be the issue. It's the emotional meaning that is attached to it. So, for example, a forgotten text message may not simply feel like a forgotten text message. It feels like rejection. It feels like I don't matter. It feels like you've abandoned me. It feels like I am not important to you. You don't even respond to me. And once those deeper emotions become activated, the nervous system starts responding to the wound rather than the event. So I often tell clients that dysregulation is going to shrink the room. When people are regulated, there are multiple possibilities. There's multiple choices. There's multiple interpretations, a lot of options. People come dysregulated, the room gets very small. And suddenly that feels like there's only one interpretation, only one choice, one perspective, one reality. And that rigidity makes connection incredibly difficult, if not impossible. So one of the greatest benefits of emotional regulation is that it gives you access to choice. Instead of automatically reacting and screaming and yelling and lashing out, you can pause. Instead of assuming, you can ask. Instead of attacking, you could express. Instead of defending, you could just be curious and go to the feeling. And instead of withdrawing, you could stay in the present. Because that pause, that's where healthy relationships are built. Not because regulated people never get upset. Of course they do. It's not because regulated people never get triggered. They absolutely do too. The difference is that regulated people recover more quickly. They notice what's happening inside themselves sooner. They understand their tell, and they're responsible for their reaction sooner, and they return to connection sooner. And that's why emotional regulation is so powerful, because it allows you to remain connected to your values and who you want to be, even when you're disconnected from comfort. It allows you to remain the person you want to be, the highest level, the highest version of you, even when emotions become very intense. And that is one of the most important skills that anyone can develop in a relationship. Because even your best self isn't revealed when everything is easy. Your best self is actually revealed in the moments when it's difficult. And emotional regulation is what helps you access that version of you. So another huge misconception about emotional regulation is that it means staying calm all the time. I have people tell me this all the time. And they imagine that emotional healthy individuals are just people who never get angry, they never get upset, they never feel, they never cry, they never feel anxious, they never get triggered. But that is not emotional regulation. That would actually be like emotional avoidance or emotional suppression. And that's not healthy either. The truth is that many people spend years suppressing emotions while believing that they're regulating them. They tell themselves they're fine. They push their feelings aside. They stay busy. They focus on work. They distract themselves. They're stuck in what I call flight. They avoid difficult conversations. So it's just one different type of response. They convince themselves they're over it. But emotions don't disappear simply because they're ignored. They go underground. And eventually they show up once again somewhere else. And they're going to show up as resentment. They're going to show up as anxiety. They're going to show up as irritability. They're going to show up as emotional distance. They're probably going to be extremely passive aggressive in their behavior. And that disconnection, that's going to show up as burnout and maybe even as explosions that are going to seem completely disproportionate to the situation. Have you ever met somebody who maybe says they're fine, like for weeks or months or years? They're not fine. And then suddenly they just erupt. That's often not emotional regulation. That is emotional accumulation. It's the feelings never left. They're just stored in the body, just hanging out, ready and waiting. And I often tell clients that emotions are like these warning lights on the dashboard of your car. You can put tape over the light. You can ignore it. You can pretend it's not there. You can turn up the radio and distract. But ignoring it doesn't solve the problem. That warning light exists because something needs your attention. And our emotions work much of the same way. They provide information. They tell us when something feels unsafe. They tell us when a need isn't being met. They tell us when we're hurt. They tell us when we're overwhelmed. And they tell us when we're disconnected from ourselves or from someone we love. So the goal would never be to eliminate all those emotions. The goal is to learn how to listen to them without becoming controlled by them. And that's where emotional regulation differs from emotional suppression. Suppression is going to say something like, I shouldn't feel this. Regulation says, I do feel this, and I'm going to handle it well. Suppression might say, push it down, shove it away. And regulation might say, pay very good attention to this. Suppression will say, ignore it. Regulation says, understand it. And this distinction matters enormously in relationships because many people believe that they are being mature when they're actually just avoiding. And that's not the same thing. You can't avoid difficult conversations. You can't just always avoid conflict. You can't always avoid vulnerability. You can't always avoid expressing needs. Because over time, all this will become increasingly resentful because emotions never get acknowledged or addressed. And I see this all the time in relationships. Someone says, I don't know why I feel so disconnected. But then when I begin exploring their experience with them, we can together discover that they've spent years swallowing hurt feelings. They've spent years avoiding difficult conversations, years pretending that things didn't bother them, years minimizing their pain and especially their own needs. And that is not regulation, my friend. That is self-abandonment. That is betrayal. Healthy emotional regulation requires emotional honesty. It requires your ability to say that hurt. That disappointed me, or I feel really anxious right now. I need some support from you. I need reassurance, honey. I need to talk about something, please. Now, those statements aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of emotional awareness. And awareness is always the first step towards regulation. That's where power in the pause comes from. And one of the things emotionally healthy people learn is that emotions are all temporary. They're going to rise, they're going to peak, and they're going to fall. But if we fight our emotions, or we suppress them, or we judge ourselves, or betray ourselves, they're going to stay a lot longer. And the healthiest people don't avoid feelings. They move through them. The only way out is through. They acknowledge them, they understand them, and they express them appropriately in a healthy way. And they respond intentionally in a grounded way. And this is why emotional regulation is not about it becoming less emotional. It's about becoming more emotionally skilled. Because your emotions are not an enemy. They're information, they're data. And the healthier your relationship becomes with your own emotions, then the healthier your relationships become with all the people in your life that you love and everyone you interact with. That's emotional regulation, not pretending you don't feel. Learning how to feel instead without losing yourself. One of the greatest gifts you can bring into your relationship is not your better communication. It's not going to be more relationship books. It's not going to be better conflict resolution skills. Although I do love all those things too. But the rubber meets the road with emotional regulation. Buck's got to stop here. Because nobody can feel safe if you're constantly controlled by your emotions. And I want to be careful when I say this here because sometimes people misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not saying your partner shouldn't comfort you. I'm not saying your partner shouldn't support you. I'm not saying your partner shouldn't help you through a difficult moment. But what I am saying is that healthy relationships do absolutely involve co-regulation. In fact, one of the most beautiful parts of a securely attached relationship is knowing you do not have to carry everything alone. And sometimes your partner's calm helps calm you. Sometimes their reassurance helps settle your anxiety. Sometimes their presence helps you feel safe. And that is healthy. That's human. But there is a really big difference between receiving some support and expecting your partner to manage all your emotions for you. And that's where many relationships also have some problems. When people haven't developed emotional regulation skills, they often will replace instead that responsibility for all their emotional state entirely on their partner. They're outsourcing it. Basically, I don't want to do the work, so I'll make you do it. So if you would just stop doing that, then I wouldn't be upset. If you just wouldn't say that, I wouldn't react. If you would just reassure me more, I wouldn't feel anxious. If you would just be a better communicator, I wouldn't feel triggered. If you would just change, then I'll feel okay. And while our partners absolutely influence us, they cannot become responsible for regulating us. How we feel and how we show up is our choice, because no human being has enough power to permanently regulate another person's nervous system. My friends, that's an inside job. Like if you're being robbed, you're doing it. Because two relationships require two people who can take responsibility for their own emotional experience while still supporting each other emotionally. And that balance is incredibly important, because when emotional responsibility is missing or it's outsourced, then relationships often become exhausting. It is a burden. And one person becomes that emotional caretaker, and the other becomes just emotionally dependent. So one person is constantly trying to fix and manage and adjust and accommodate, and the other is constantly needing to be rescued. And eventually both people become overwhelmed, and they don't even understand why. The healthiest couples I've worked with, they understand something important here. They get that my emotions are my responsibility. My behavior is my responsibility. My healing is my responsibility. And then your emotions are your responsibility. Your behavior is your responsibility. Your healing journey is your responsibility. And then they can come together and support each other and co-regulate and do that from that place. Not from a place of dependency or blame, but from a partnership, from unity. And that's where emotional safety starts to grow again, because emotional safety is not created by never having a difficult emotion. It's created by knowing difficult emotions can be handled safely. So think about relationships that feel safest to you. Right now, think about one. They're probably not relationships where nobody ever gets upset. They're not going to be relationships where people know how to navigate being upset. It's going to be where they know how to repair. It's going to be where they know how to apologize. It's going to be where they know how to stay present, and they know how to communicate honestly with transparency. They're going to know how to take responsibility. And I think maybe the most important one of all is they're going to know how to come back to connection after disconnection. Because that is what regulated people do. They recover faster. Not because they don't get activated, but because they notice it sooner. And if you're taking hours, days, weeks to recover, you've got a problem here. And you need to take ownership. Because people have to be able to return to connection sooner. And one of the things I often tell couples is that every relationship experiences disconnection, literally every single one. So the question isn't whether you're going to disconnect, it's how quickly you can reconnect and repair. And emotionally regulated people don't stay stuck as long. They don't spend 3 days defending themselves and arguing or ghosting or pleading their case. They don't spend 2 weeks shutting down. They don't spend months avoiding the conversation. And they don't punish or judge. They notice the rupture and they immediately begin leaning in and moving forward to repair. Because regulation is going to require that flexibility. Regulation is going to require resilience. And this is one of the reasons that emotional regulation is so strongly connected to long-term relationship satisfaction. Because when two people come together, the relationship becomes safe. Conversations become safe. Conflict is inevitable, and it feels safer too. Vulnerability is safer. I want to share more, do more, be more. Intimacy comes more safer. We're going to explore. We're going to have novelty because both people trust that difficult emotions won't automatically become destructive behaviors. And that is what creates trust, not perfection, but predictability. The confidence that when hard moments happen, which they will, we know how to handle them. We know how to stay connected. And we're not managing our partner, we're just each managing ourselves. And then we're going to know how to come back together again, how to repair. And that is what healthy relationships are built on. Not the absence of difficult emotions, but the ability to navigate them together. Emotional regulation is not about becoming less emotional. It's about becoming less controlled by your emotions. Because the strongest relationships are not built by people who never get triggered. They are built by people who know how to stay connected after they do. I want you to think about that for a moment. Every couple gets hurt. Every couple gets disappointed. Every couple experiences conflict. And every couple has moments when fear, anger, sadness, insecurity, shame shows up. The difference isn't whether those emotions exist. We know they do. The difference is what happens next. Do those emotions create understanding or destruction? Do they create connection where you're stronger in your bond or distance? Do they create repair or resentment? When people are emotionally regulated, they often become the exact opposite of who they want to be. The loving partner becomes critical. The patient partner becomes reactive. The compassionate partner becomes very defensive. And the connected partner becomes withdrawn. And this is not because they stopped loving each other, but because survival took over. And when survival takes over, connection becomes impossible. And that is why emotional regulation may be one of the most important relationship skills you are ever going to develop. Because every conversation depends on it. And all your conflict is going to depend on it. And your repair is certainly going to depend on it. And every act of intimacy needs it. Every moment of vulnerability needs it. And the quality of your relationship is often limited by the quality of your regulation. So here's what I'm going to hope you're going to take away from all this today in this conversation. You don't need to become perfect. You don't need to stop having emotions. You don't need to stop getting triggered because you can't. You simply need to become more aware of what happens inside you when those moments happen, and that you can do. Because awareness creates choice, and choice creates that change that we're all looking for. And the moment you can recognize that your nervous system is taken over is the moment you gain the ability to do something about it, to do something different, to pause, to breathe, to become curious, to stay connected, to respond from your values instead of your wounds. And that is where healthier relationships are built. Not in perfection, but in awareness. And in the accountability and the regulation that follows that. Your willingness to return to connect. So if you found all of this helpful today, you're going to like my next video too. Because I'm going to continue down this path. I'm going to talk about something that a lot of people experience, but few people recognize. We're going to talk about the specific ideas of what emotional dysregulation actually looks like inside a relationship. I'm going to give you examples, and I bet you're going to be able to see yourself in them because it doesn't always look like yelling, although sometimes it does. You're going to see anger, of course, and sometimes it's that defensiveness or criticism or even shutting down. But I want to show you specifics so you can understand that and relate to it. And I want to be able to give you the tools to do something about it.